Kia ora, ko Catherine Leining au. It is such a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to you who've managed to make it to this point in the day. Yeah, there's nothing like climate change at the end of the day when you're feeling a little bit worn down. To give you a sense of my background as I come to climate change issues, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not originally from these here parts. I'm from Utah in the United States. My mountain is the Wasatch, and I'm from the Great Salt Lake. Sometimes when people hear I'm from Utah, their first two questions are you Mormon and do you ski? Because we hosted the 2002 Winter Olympics. And but I've learned in New Zealand the question is often, that's where Burt Munro set the world speed record on the world's fastest Indian. So that is very close to where I grew up. I moved to New Zealand in 2003. Because at the time I was doing climate change policy work with George W. Bush in office. And so I consider myself a climate policy refugee. I was looking for a country where I could try to work toward climate and make progress. Now looking back with Trump, that was actually the good old days. And I'm glad that I'm still here, although I have to say 15 years later, we've not made the kind of progress that I thought we were on the cusp of making when I first moved here to work on the carbon tax. So I'll tell you just a little bit about Motu. We are a nonprofit, independent think tank, research institute, a fairly small organization. And I'm here presenting in my personal capacity. We don't have organizational views on things. We work as a research cooperative. I also want to acknowledge the Aotearoa Foundation, who has funded our work on our Low Emission Future program, and really grateful for their support. Today, I'm just going to provide some big picture context on climate change, talk about some work that we did with the dialogue process on pathways, and then 3 sets of reflections on acting locally, targets, circular economy, and engagement. And so looking at the mitigation challenge, so most of you are probably aware of the basic science of climate change, but essentially we have this very thin layer of greenhouse gases around the planet, and they have these interesting properties, and one of them is that they allow ultraviolet radiation to come in from the sun. But when it radiates back off the sun, the surface of the Earth, it comes back with a different wavelength. So the gases actually trap that. So they allow the UV in, but the infrared gets trapped as it's going back out. And this is actually a really useful feature. That's what gives us the warmth that has allowed life to evolve here as it has. But as we add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, it's like putting more feathers into a duvet, and that layer traps more and more heat, and that's the problem that we are running into. And the challenge here is that some of these gases stay in the atmosphere for thousands of years, even over 10,000 years for some of them. So this is a cumulative problem. And I like to use the image of a bathtub. When you're filling a bathtub, even if you turn down the faucet to a trickle, you can still flood the room when the bathtub is full. And that's why we have to get to net zero. It's not enough just to emit less. We actually have to get to net zero. At the rate at which we're producing greenhouse gas emissions, we are going to have filled our bathtub for 1.5 degrees within 10 years. And that bathtub, that's filled forever, like for the rest of humanity. That's how urgent this problem is and how challenging this problem is. Now, we do have things like forest sinks that can help to absorb some of that carbon. That's the equivalent of like putting a sponge into that bathtub and absorbing some of the water and taking it out. And then we're hoping to develop things like direct air capture technology that would sort of vacuum out the CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into something. But those are very expensive, and it takes a lot of energy to pull that CO2 out of the air. So how are you going to come out ahead of the game here? So that's the challenge that we're facing. It's a cumulative problem. It's not enough to get to net zero. We have to get to net zero before we fill up our bathtub. So if we slam the brakes on emissions now, it buys us more time to develop solutions before we filled up our bathtub. So in the Paris Agreement, countries negotiated to limit temperature rises to well below 2 degrees C. This was in 2015, and then to strive toward 1.5 degrees C. And although that's the goal of the agreement, the targets that countries have accepted so far to 2030 don't put us on a pathway for either 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. They actually put us on a pathway that's somewhere between 2.8 and 3.2, depending on which study you look at. And so this shows that we're actually, without any policies at all, we've been on our way to 4 degrees. With the current policies under the Paris Agreement, current pledges were closer to 3 degrees, and you can see how dramatically we need to shift if we wanted to move down to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees C. Essentially, we need emissions to peak now and decline rapidly. So the IPCC just came out recently with a special report on what does a 1.5 degree C future look like. And what they've reported is that we've already had 1 degree C increase in temperature since the pre-industrial period. That's measuring global mean surface temperature. Under business as usual, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees C over 2030 to 2052, somewhere in that. The Paris pledges set us on this course for 3 degrees. And it's still, but barely still, possible to achieve 1.5 degrees C. And what really struck me with this report is how big a difference there is between 1.5 and 2. And I didn't know this before I read the report. Since I've been here in New Zealand, I've worked for central government and I worked for Wellington City Council and then Motu. While I was in the central government, I was actually our Kyoto carbon markets negotiator on the delegation in the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties on Climate Change in 2009. This was the conference that was supposed to create what eventually became the Paris Agreement 6 years later, but it took countries 6 years more to get there. And at that point, I thought 2 degrees was good enough. And I was really wrong. And it wasn't until I read this report that I really understood that. I've been reading these special reports since probably 1995, something like that. I'm not a climate scientist. My degree's in biology, but I've basically been doing climate policy, which is a very kind of integrated approach. And I thought that 2 degrees was enough. But this is the first report where I actually cried when I read it. I'm used to just kind of getting depressed. And here was why. There is an enormous amount of regional variation around the averages that people are throwing around as targets. So this shows on the left-hand side the increase in the hottest days, and the bottom is the increase in the coldest nights. And the left-hand side is 1.5 degrees C, and the right-hand side is 2 degrees C. And what we're seeing is that for a global average of 1.5 degrees C, there are parts of the world that will actually see an average of 3 degrees C. And for a 2 degrees C future, there are parts of the world that will see an average of 4 degrees C. And what this shows is like those increases in the coldest nights, those are increases of 4 to 10 degrees. And that was when I started to cry. I mean, what does that do to the permafrost? What does that do to species that are used to living in those bands? What does that do to global circulation processes in our global weather system? I mean, that's phenomenal. And that's for 1.5 and 2 degrees C, and we're on track for 3. And that was when this really hit me, just how serious this is. So when you go through these reports, they provide a comparison of what 1.5 and 2 degrees C looks like across a whole range of indicators, and it's just really dire. One that's easy to point to is coral reefs. Under a 2 degree C future, we'll lose 70 to 90% of our coral reefs, and under the 1.5 degree C, we'll lose about 100%. How did we get to a point where those were our choices? Between 90% loss of our coral reefs and 100% loss of our coral reefs? But I mean, the impacts for polar ice, for sea level rise, for poverty, for extinctions, I mean, it's extraordinary, the impact that 0.5 degrees C has. And we're already at 1 degree C, and we're feeling the impacts now, and it's hard to miss. I don't know if you caught that news story in November when there was the heat wave in Australia, and they lost 23,000 fruit bats. They just dropped dead out of the trees and hit the ground in 2 days of a heat wave because they can't live over 42.5 degrees C, and they hit that heat wave. That's a third of their population wiped out in 2 days, and we're only at 1 degree C. There was a presenter from Australia at the New Zealand Wind Energy Conference last week, and he said he had this little lifestyle block where he would go and plant trees to try to offset his carbon footprint. The trees are dying. There's no water for the trees. So we can't offset our way out of this problem. So what will it take for a 1.5 degree C future? Well, we need global net CO2 to be reduced about 45% below 2010 levels by 2030. So roughly, we're thinking about halving today's emissions. That's the easiest way to think about it. Well, if I ask myself, gosh, how do I cut in half what I emit today in the next 10 years? That's a big ask. It's interesting, for 2 degrees C, we have a net zero by 2075. So we buy ourselves an extra 25 years. We have to do this anyway. This is the bathtub problem. We have to turn it off. If we do it 25 years earlier, we save ourselves a world of pain. And we're going to have to do it anyway, if we could just get our act together and start moving a bit more quickly. The IPCC reported the kinds of reductions we need for global methane, 35% below the 2010 level by 2050. And it's not all that different for about 2 degrees C. This is because CO2 and methane have different impacts on the atmosphere. And as the zero carbon bill comes out, this is going to be a big issue. You're going to hear about this in the media. And we need reductions in other gases as well. So here's what New Zealand's greenhouse gas emission profile looks like. This is our emissions from 2017, which were just recently released. There's a 2-year lag on the data. So energy contributes about 41% of our emissions, and the biological emissions from agriculture is about 48%. And the forestry sector offsets roughly a third of our emissions. And so keep in mind, we're supposed to be peaking emissions as soon as possible and then bringing them down. Our gross emissions have increased 23% since 1990. And net emissions have increased 65%. That's because we have this big wave of trees that are coming through that were planted earlier. This is the wall of wood, and so what has been a big net sink for us is now moving closer and closer toward being a source. And our per capita emissions are 16.9 tons of CO2 per year, which is very high. You know, a 1.5 degree C future is even goes into the negative tons per person range, so we have a long way to go. And here's a projection for emissions. This is a bit outdated now. Hopefully it's going to change according to forestry accounting rules, not because I don't think the atmosphere is actually seeing anything that different. So this is our emissions through 2030. This is not the emissions profile of a country whose emissions are peaking right now and then rapidly declining. And you can see that that bottom line is coming up toward the top. So we've got gross emissions without forestry on top. The net is showing that we're losing our forest sink, which has been offsetting some of our gross emissions. So here's how our current targets compare to what the IPCC is recommending as a global level. So right now, our 2030 target under Paris is a 30% reduction below 2005. That's for all greenhouse gases. That's about 26% below 2010. And the IPCC is recommending 45% below 2010, and the 2 C is 20% below 2010. And then for 2050, we currently have a target of 50% reduction below 2050, below 1990 by 2050. But as you're very aware, the government's been talking about some kind of a net zero target. The IPCC is recommending net zero for CO2 and at least 35% reduction in methane by 2010. And again, the 2 C buys us some more time, but we have to get to the same place. But what does net zero mean for New Zealand? And that's what we're going to have launched into the media when the zero carbon bill comes out. And this is why it's so hard. This is a very helpful graph that was presented by the Interim Committee on Climate Change, which has been advising the government on this issue of agriculture in the ETS. And it shows what the actual warming effect is going to be from our 2016 emissions over time. And this shows the next 200 years. It's actually going to go on for much longer than that. It doesn't end after 200 years. So the blue line is methane, the red line is CO2, and the green line is our nitrous oxide. And that shows us how methane is short-lived in the atmosphere, but it has a huge impact in the short term, and then it trails off more quickly, but it still continues to warm. So the party deal that was struck, that was announced in stuff a few days ago, is that there's going to be some kind of a split target. And you know, it can make sense to have a split target. Having a split target does not mean we don't have to reduce all of these gases. This shows what the impact of methane is for the next 200 years. We can't ignore that. So here's, people are talking about how our 2030 target doesn't go far enough, but here's the challenge that we're already facing. So over the 2021 to 2030 period, we have a 601 megaton CO2 budget under the Paris Agreement. This is our sort of allowance over 10 years. And here's what our projected emissions are going to look like. So the orange is basically agriculture, and the gray is the sectors who are in the ETS right now, which is like energy, transportation, and waste, and industrial processes. So you'll notice there's a gap. It's a big gap. That gap is 203 megatons. That's about 2.5 years worth of emissions in our current target gap, and everyone's saying we need to go further. And here's how the government has said it's going to try to allocate that budget. So it said, right, we'll basically cover the agriculture emissions with what they need. We're going to give out a number of free units to the big industrial emitters in the ETS, which they've promised to do under legislation. That gives us this little margin of 44 million tons, which we're going to sell at auction to try to help meet ETS demand. And then we've got this big gap. That is not a very satisfying picture if you're a participant in the emissions trading scheme, and it doesn't explain to us how we're going to bridge that gap. And so they've explained, well, business as usual forestry might bridge 18 of that. If we had really high uptake of billion trees, which we might not, then we could get up to an additional 28 megatons. But we also have an ETS bank that's coming in. So anyway, we still have a gap problem. And we need to either solve this through domestic mitigation, or we need to buy international emission reductions overseas. If we do buy them, they need to be really good. They need to have the same atmospheric quality as if we were producing those reductions in New Zealand, and that could be expensive. So if we had to pay $25 to $50 a ton to buy offshore emission units, that could cost us $4 to $9 billion over the period, which is a considerable amount of money, and we could be investing that in New Zealand instead. Now, Motu did some really interesting work on household consumption emissions. So these inventories and targets are all done on a production basis, but we looked at how much do households actually consume, and this takes into account the emissions that are embedded in the products that we buy and so on. And what's interesting here is that the food that we consume is about 40% of that footprint. And you'll see there's a breakdown, the CO2, which is the energy associated with that food, the methane, and the nitrous oxide. And then housing and utilities are about 25%, and transport's about 25%. So this is using a metric of global warming potential 100. There are people who debate whether or not that's the right metric. That's the standard international convention that we're using here. But recycling is really important, but think about where you put your fork. And the transportation one is a big one, too. And this is also really interesting because the three bars on the right are higher income households, 90,000 to 200,000, and then the three bars on the left are lower income households. And this is the bottom 20%, the middle 20%, and the highest 20%. And what this shows is how much swing there is across different household types in New Zealand according to how much discretionary spending they do and what that means for our emissions. So we have a lot of choices that we make. We can go beyond meeting our basic needs, but we've got choices. So we did some work with a dialogue group a couple of years ago, our Low Emission Future Dialogue, and it was just a really interesting selection of people from across sectors. And we did an exercise on trying to envision a low-emission economy for New Zealand. And it was a really interesting exercise because it was a very, we were driven and we were interested in what we wanted to do, but we got stuck because we're so locked into our current way of thinking. And we're trying to think, well, this is the rate at which we're changing now. How fast can we change from where we are and that kind of thing. So we changed the exercise and we said, okay, it's 2050. We've gotten to net zero emissions. We've got a successful economy. Tell us what that looks like and how did we get there? Backcasting. It's a really powerful thought exercise, and as you're doing regional planning, it's worth thinking about because it helps to set you free from the things that you think you don't know and to focus on the stuff that we do know. And suddenly we started to see pathways that would emerge. And what was interesting is that for this group, by the end of the process, we had shifted into realizing that actually a zero net emission future did lie ahead for New Zealand, and it was just a case of when. It might be 2040, it might be 2070, but we could see the vision. As a group, we were talking about this as the new reality. And I knew how far this process had come because we had people from some of the major generators and big companies in New Zealand who were involved in this process, and they went to put their names on the report, and they're like, wow, we have gone so far from where our management is sitting right now. But it was really interesting to take people on this journey, and this is where we got to. What does a zero net emission future look like? Well, at the center is people. It's people and climate smart behavior. And then we have a ring of enablers: policy, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, and regulations and urban design. And then we need to decarbonize electricity and then electrify as much industrial heat and transport as we possibly can. This is a beautiful puzzle piece that has to come together. Decarbonize electricity and electrify. In the land sector, we need to have really, really efficient livestock production. We need to look at diversification into horticulture and other crops. And then we need to use forestry both for offsets and for biofuels. And then there will be some residual emissions that happen here, and for that we need some kind of carbon capture technology, which may not be commercially viable yet, but is on the horizon. When I look at this picture, I get excited because I can see that working. I can taste it when I look at this. Like, that is possible for us. It's not going to be easy, but I can see that being possible, and I think it's going to be easier for us than for other people. And then our group started to look into more the details of those pathways, and then I got even more excited because there are so many possible actions that we can take that would support that. Here's stationary energy, here's transport, here's agriculture. And we don't necessarily know which of these is best. It's way too early to pick winners, so we need a process that gives us adaptive pathways, that allows us to be open to possibilities as they come up, that's opening up doors. We don't have to lock ourselves into EVs versus hydrogen right now, but we need to be thinking about what this might look like in the longer term. The Productivity Commission has taken this kind of work one step further by commissioning some modeling to say specifically, can we actually get to these levels? So they modeled a net zero emissions target and a 25 megaton target by 2050. And they said, yes, it is possible. These are just scenarios, they're not predictions. But there were three types of scenarios, possible worlds that they identified. So one of them is it's policy driven. Like government puts a big carbon price out there. There's not a lot of technology change, but we really force change through government. The second is we get this big miracle technologies that come through that really help with decarbonizing our energy and our food, but they radically disrupt what we're doing today. And then the third option is technologies that allow us to keep doing what we're doing today, but to do it really, really well. So that would be the methane vaccine, for example. And they did modeling that shows what kind of reductions you could potentially get under both of these sets of targets. And what's interesting looking at this is the degree of difference between a zero target and a 25 megaton target. For some sectors, that difference is more significant than others. But what's interesting is we're only still talking a reasonable. I mean, this does not represent decimation of the agriculture sector, I think is what I'm trying to say. We need to have reductions everywhere, but there's still agricultural emissions in this picture, and we can still get to net zero. So, some reflections on setting targets. I spent a year working at the Wellington City Council, and I was there in 2013, and it was a really opportune time because they were just revising their climate change action plan. So we had a mayor who was completely committed to climate change. We had councillors who believed in the science and wanted to take action. Right? We had council staff who were enthusiastic and energized and highly intelligent. And we had a really steep target that was already in place, a 30% reduction below 2000 levels by 2020. Way more stringent than our target. So for a frustrated US climate analyst, this was like nirvana. It's like, wow, what can we do here? So I started to talk to management, and I said, okay, we've got this great target, so where's the pathway for getting there? Do we have like a wedge diagram? This is, we're going to get this much from transport, and this much from energy efficiency, and this much, I was like, oh, we don't have a pathway. We don't have a wedge diagram. I was like, oh, okay, all right. Do you have an inventory? So do you know how well we're doing? We're tracking against this target. Well, actually, inventory is a couple years out of date, and our council staff have been trying to do it, but it's not really consistent. We've got some really missing data, and it's not very good. It's like, okay, well, how's the engagement strategy been around this? Like, how many Wellingtonians are aware of this target and have actually taken it on as their own? I'm like, I don't think really people are doing that. I'm a climate activist. I have never once woken up in the morning and said, ooh, I need to take the bus because I've got to help Wellington beat its greenhouse gas target. I don't think most of Wellington even knows we have a greenhouse gas target. They certainly aren't owning it. They certainly aren't writing it in and reporting on it to their board. So it was a real problem. So I said, well, and where's the budget for this pathway inventory and engagement strategy? And you can guess what the answer was to that one. And I think that this is a situation that a lot of councils find themselves in as they start to create these plans. So, it's hard for local government. We've got this murky legislative mandate around the role of local governments and climate change under the RMA. We've got accounting differences between national and local accounting because there's more consumption-based emissions that are accounted for at the local government level. There's a lack of data. People like the Wellington City Council just didn't have data for 1990. You can't really set a 1990 base year if you don't have 1990 data. And you don't have control over a lot of the things that you're trying to set targets on. Wellington has all of this renewable generation within its boundaries, but we have to use a national grid emission factor because we're hooked up to the national grid. So we don't even get the credit for the things that we're doing really, really well. We can't control how high the emission price is for government. We can't control business decisions. We can't really go and purchase international offsets. So it's really hard for local governments to figure out how do we play in this space when our citizens are saying, we need a target, but we don't actually have control over what we can deliver. That's not what targets are supposed to be for. And I think we've had a real problem around focusing on numerical targets instead of thinking about what we can actually do together to deliver the outcomes that we're looking for. So I'd just like to put a challenge out there to rethink targets as you guys are going through these types of exercises. They should be an indicator of progress and not the outcome. Think of them as an opportunity. And not as something that you have to do. And don't use a single metric of tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Come up with a bunch of metrics that make sense. And I was excited to hear about the regional planning exercises that are going around to talk to people about indicators for well-being and indicators for spatial planning, to create a diversity of approaches for breaking this down into something that makes sense. You know, if you walk up to a 15-year-old today and say, you need to reduce your emissions by 10% below 1990 levels, that doesn't mean anything to them. They weren't alive. Like, we don't think that way. We need to create targets and measures that matter to us. So before you set the target, set goals that make sense to people. No one will go on a starvation diet, okay? You have to put the well-being first and say, we're not achieving net zero emissions, we're achieving net zero well-being. That's a very different outcome. So these need to be goals that people can really resonate with and that create a vision and that start to develop pathways. We should use a range of targets and metrics. Every target needs a pathway or it's just a number. And people need to own it. We need to be resilient to different futures, and we need to look beyond 2050. If all we do between now and 2050 is plant a lot of trees, we're going to end up a huge problem because we don't have enough trees to keep offsetting for the rest of the century. We need to be investing in energy transformation now. The trees can help, but we can't only do trees. So we need to be thinking long-term about how we're going to use offsets across the century. We need to measure and report publicly on progress. We need accountability. And we need to think collectively and exponentially. One-to-one offsetting is not going to take us where we need to go. We need to be thinking about multiplier targets, domino effects. How can you create a ripple across your whole supply chain? It's not like, oh, I emitted 1 ton today, I'm going to buy 1 ton of carbon credits. We need to be thinking bigger than that, about how we transform whole systems. And it takes creative thinking, it takes collaborative work, but I see huge, exciting potential here. So just some reflections on the circular economy. I found a fantastic report just in preparation for this conference called the Circularity Gap Report. It was released at the World Economic Forum in January, and they're looking at how does climate change and the circular economy fit together. So one of its findings, the global economy is only 9% circular. You know? That means only 9% of our, the rest of it's just going to waste. That's referring to the annual reuse of minerals, fossil fuels, metals, and biomass. We have an enormous potential for improvement there. 62% of global greenhouse gases are produced during the production process. So as the manufacturers, producers who've been participating in this exercise, as you're thinking about redesigning your process, there's a huge potential for mitigation here. So we need to shift from take, make, waste, as we've been hearing today, and they talk about a really interesting concept of mass value carbon. And I find this really intriguing. This is brand new to me, so I want to do more. Anyway, if you want to get a sense of where emissions are coming from, this is one way to slice the pie, looking at the different stages of the production process globally and where emissions come from. So the resource extraction is 25%, processing 20%, production, provision, and then consumption and waste. And so each of those stages represents an opportunity for mitigation. And then at the sector level, this is where different sectors are contributing on a consumption basis to emissions. And I know this is going to be a little bit difficult for you to read, but this is where that mass value carbon nexus comes together. So at the top, they've identified 3 different types of sectors. We've got housing, mobility, and consumables at the top. And you'll see that they all have high mass, meaning they involve a lot of materials. They generate high value, and they've got high carbon. So that's kind of a cluster of characteristics. Then there's 3 at the bottom, which is services, health, and communication. Very low mass, very low material input. Relatively low carbon, but higher value. So the services economy is a way of generating high value, low emissions. In the middle is nutrition. Very high mass, very high carbon, very low value. That's pretty stark. So I think there's some interesting strategic questions for New Zealand here about where we want to focus the value in our economy. This report has some really interesting sector case studies that I haven't had time to read yet, but if you're interested in space, I really recommend you take a look at it. This is a quote from the CEO of Circular Economy, which helped produce the report. A 1.5 degree C world can only be a circular world. So this is an interesting question about, well, how big is the circle? And where does the circle land? So this is the work by Kate Raworth on creating the donut concept. And the inner circle is the social threshold. So the basic concept is we put well-being at the center. And there's a certain amount of emissions that have to happen in order to satisfy the basic well-being needs of people. And the outer, the darker layer is the biophysical boundary, and that's our magic donut. It's that zone between what it takes to meet people's basic needs and what the planet can handle. That's our landing space for our circular economy. And so this is the New Zealand donut. If you go on their website, you can compare us to the G20 average and compare us to other countries. And they give a bunch of well-being indicators in the middle. But you can see that on all of the environmental things except blue water, New Zealand is way over our biophysical boundary. I really like this concept, though, because, again, it puts well-being at the center of what we need to deliver. So I'll just end with a couple words on engagement. I'm just about out of time. But what does it take to move from information to action? So people used to think it was a problem of just information provision. And this was the progression that people had to go through. And if you look at the climate denial campaign, this is the different stages of that they've moved through. So climate change is real, the impacts are serious, humans are responsible, and solutions are available. The IPCC has nailed all of this. There is no doubt about those four things anymore. But here are the questions we haven't tackled yet. Does climate change matter to me? Will my actions make a difference? And are the solutions a threat to me? This is where the just transition comes in, because there are a lot of people who are more concerned about the solutions than they are about climate change. And if that's the case, then we're doing it wrong. So we need to replace some old excuses. It's too hard. It's not too hard. The scale of change is unprecedented. The scale of change is unprecedented, but not the speed. So we've seen these types of rapid changes. Look at what's happened with cell phone technology. We have seen rapid changes. It just needs to happen at scale. And New Zealand actually has some huge advantages here with our renewable potential and our land base. It's too expensive. Actually, the costs of inaction are far greater than the costs of action. And that has been consistently reinforced since Lord Stern said that in 2007. And acting sooner saves us money. We're too small. Hear this one all the time. Everyone is too small. That's the whole point. This is a collective problem, and it takes a collective solution. A pie has the same number of calories if you cut it into small pieces. And we'll make a global impact when people copy us. And it's too late. This is the new kid on the block. It is still possible to do 1.5 degrees C, but this is what's so important. This is not a binary choice. It's not a choice, I'd rather have an iPhone to X, but I can really only afford the 8, that's probably good enough. This is like, there's a whole spectrum of impacts between 1.5 and 2, and the closer we can get to being lower, the better. Every fraction makes a difference. And here's where change begins. Let me help. It starts at the heart level, where we are today. We are humans. We have this fundamental human giving compassion. Let me help. When a pod of whales washes up on the beach, Kiwis do us proud by showing up with the buckets and the towels to try to keep them alive. We've got 1 million species on the verge of extinction. We have to show up. Personal change, social change, and system change. They all start with that, let me help. So just forthcoming, as Rod mentioned, we've got a zero carbon bill. There'll be an opportunity for submissions. It'll be important that we make our voices heard. We've got this Climate Leaders Coalition. The Eastland Community Trust and the Eastland Group are now members of this. It's very exciting. Very high-profile New Zealand companies who are making a public pledge to reduce their emissions, setting very serious targets, working with their suppliers. A really great initiative to become involved in. A new initiative called the Aotearoa Circle, which is looking at more sustainable use of resources, again involving some of the big movers and players in New Zealand. Might be another opportunity to get involved. And there's huge international networks of people working at the local level, and there's a lot of knowledge sharing online. There's a lot of solution sharing. As you guys develop solutions, please send them out to the world, and you can go out and be scanning about what might be adaptable here. So my key message is New Zealand must be part of the global solution to climate change, and all climate action is local. When I was a climate change negotiator in Copenhagen, someone took my photograph on that last night, and the look of complete exhaustion and despair on my face was a life-changing moment, because I realized that the solution is not going to happen there. I had thought that being a negotiator was where I was going to be able to make change. This is where change happens. It's a korero like this where change starts to happen. Local governments, businesses, communities have exciting potential to drive decarbonization, and I've been really inspired by the case studies we've heard this afternoon. We've got to shift our strategy from least cost to highest value. Everyone keeps talking about this is a least cost transition. we need to make this a high-value transition. And it's not just value added, but value maintained. And we need to be thinking about future generations when we're counting that value. And finally, people started off thinking about climate change as an environmental issue, and then it became an economic issue. It's actually a people issue. People have to know that they feel safe in this transition, and that our communities are going to be taken care of as we make the kind of dramatic changes we've been talking about today. So just the final thought that I'll leave you with, a lot of people are talking now about declaring war on climate change. And I find that language really distressing. Because think about war. First of all, the climate hasn't done anything wrong. The climate supports us and nurtures us, so we don't want to make war on climate change. The climate's just responding to what we're doing, right? War involves good and evil, enemies and friends, polarization, separation, devastation. Those are the images of war: privation, violence. I would rather see us waging collaboration on climate change. So I will leave you with that note, and thank you very much. There are some resources from Motu online, and I'll leave these in our presentation, which I hope you will have access to. You can have a play on our Motu household climate tool. And thanks very much.